empire rise, systems break. History leaves scars that never fully disappear.
Japan's energy problem is not that it is poor, backward, disorganized, or incapable of long-term planning. In many ways, the opposite is true. Japan is one of the most sophisticated industrial societies on Earth. It is wealthy, orderly, technologically advanced, and deeply experienced in managing scarcity. But that is precisely what makes its energy vulnerability so unsettling, because when a country this advanced still depends on an external fuel lifeline, it cannot fully secure, replace, or defend by itself. The issue is no longer just economic. It becomes strategic, it becomes structural, and in the deepest sense, it becomes civilizational. On the surface, Japan still looks stable. The trains run on time, the factories function, the cities glow at night, and the water system still projects competence and control. Yet beneath that surface lies a weakness that has haunted modern Japan for decades. The country's prosperity still rests on imported energy moving across distant and fragile routes. Japan's own 2025 Strategic Energy Plan states that the country depends on the Middle East for more than 90% of its crude oil imports, and explicitly warns that worsening instability in the region directly threatens Japanese energy security. Reuters has likewise reported that about 95% of Japan's crude oil imports come from the Middle East, and that roughly 70% typically pass through the Strait of Hormuz. That means a single narrow maritime choke point in one of the most politically volatile regions in the world sits across the path of much of Japan's oil lifeline. That fact alone should change how we think about Japanese stability, because this is not just a technical supply issue, and it is not merely a story about shipping lanes, energy prices, or emergency planning. It is about the hidden architecture of national survival in an island economy with minimal domestic fossil fuel resources. Japan's industrial system still runs on imported fuel. Its transport network depends on it. Its thermal power sector depends on it. Its petrochemical chains, manufacturing systems, logistics flows, and wider economic metabolism all depend on it. So when people talk about Japanese prosperity, they are often describing something real, but incomplete. What they usually do not see is that this prosperity stands on an energy foundation that is not truly sovereign. It is linked to distant producers, foreign selene, alliance guarantees, and geopolitical conditions that Japan alone cannot fully control. That is what makes the situation dangerous. A country does not have to be collapsing in order to be strategically fragile. Sometimes the fragility lies in the quiet fact that daily normality depends on an external artery staying open. And once you see Japan through that lens, the picture changes. The story is no longer simply about a successful advanced economy.
Behind every great power stands an invisible machine of energy, steel, and movement.
It becomes a story about an advanced economy living under the shadow of a permanent fuel dependency that never fully disappears, no matter how rich, disciplined, or technologically refined the country becomes. And this is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes far more than a map detail. It matters because it is not just one shipping route among many. It is one of the central arteries of the global energy system, a narrow passage through which enormous volumes of oil and gas continue to flow. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has said that flows through Hormuz in 2024 and early 2025 accounted for more than 1/4 of total global seaborne oil trade, around 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption, and about 1/5 of global LNG trade. In other words, this is not some secondary corridor that only specialists care about. It is one of the pressure points of industrial civilization itself. For the world, that makes hormones important. For Japan, it makes Hormuz personal, because Japanese exposure is not broad and diversified in a way that might soften the blow. It is concentrated. Many countries are affected when tensions rise in the Gulf, but Japan is one of the countries for which that danger translates, especially directly, into energy insecurity. Of course, Japan is not naive about this dot. It has built buffers. Reuters reports that Japan holds national oil stockpiles equivalent to about 254 days of net import. Well, Japanese companies currently have about 3 weeks of LNG inventory. That means Japan would not instantly go dark if Hormuz were disrupted. There would be no cinematic overnight collapse. The lights would not simply go out the next morning. Planes would not all stop flying in a single dramatic moment. And this is exactly why many people underestimate the danger. They imagine that if a country has reserves, then the problem is solved. But reserves do not erase vulnerability. They only buy time. They turn an immediate shock into a delayed crisis. They create resilience, yes, but compressed resilience, time-limited resilience, resilience that lives under a clock. And that distinction matters, because the real threat is not what happens tomorrow morning if a disruption begins. The real threat is what happens if a temporary crisis becomes a prolonged one. Then the issue stops being one of emergency inventory and starts becoming one of economics, politics, and social pressure. First come price spikes, then procurement stress, then higher electricity costs, then pressure on manufacturing, shipping, chemicals, transport, and energy-intensive industry. Then households begin to feel the squeeze through utility bills, fuel costs, and imported inflation. Then markets react. Then the political system has to reassure the public, stabilize expectations, and manage growing anxiety. In that sense, the most dangerous energy crises are often not the sudden ones, but the grinding ones.
Power is not what a nation claims. Power is what its system can keep alive.
The ones that do not destroy an economy in one blow, but force it into a condition of prolonged strain. Japan can withstand a short disruption better than alarmists might think. But that does not mean the structure is strong. It means the structure is fragile in a way that unfolds over time. The more prolonged the disruption, the more Japan's dependence stops looking like a logistics problem and starts looking like a strategic trap. And that is the deeper issue. Too much of Japan's normal prosperity still rests on the assumption that a narrow and vulnerable maritime corridor remains open, peaceful, and protected. That is not a small assumption. It is one of the biggest assumptions holding up the Japanese economy. This vulnerability became even sharper after Fukushima, because the disaster did not simply trigger a public debate about nuclear safety. It transformed the balance of Japan's entire energy system. Before the 2011 disaster, nuclear power gave Japan something extremely valuable, a partial domestic buffer inside an otherwise import-dependent structure. It did not make Japan energy independent, and no serious person claimed that it did, but it gave the country a measure of internal resilience. It reduced how much Japan had to rely on imported fossil fuels for electricity, It gave policymakers at least one major non-fossil, largely domestic source of baseload power in a country otherwise defined by resource scarcity. After Fukushima, that buffer was dramatically weakened. Reuters reported this week that Japan had 54 reactors before the disaster, but now only 33 remain technically operable and just 15 are currently active. That is not a minor adjustment. It represents a profound narrowing of Japan's domestic fallback options. Every reactor that remains idle means more pressure on imported LNG, more pressure on thermal generation, and more exposure to global fuel markets at precisely the moment when geopolitics has become less stable, not more. And this is what makes the problem so serious. Japan did not lose one major energy source and then replace it with a secure domestic alternative. It shifted into a more import-heavy equilibrium in a more dangerous world. The country's energy ministry has also noted that world dependence on the Middle East is lower for LNG and coal than for crude oil. Japan still relies heavily on overseas imports across the fossil fuel mix. So even where the geographic profile is somewhat broader, the structural pattern remains the same: limited domestic resources, high external dependence, vulnerability to maritime disruption, and sensitivity to global price shock. In other words, the issue is not just oil. It is the whole architecture of constrained choice. Japan needs crude. It needs LNG. It still uses coal. Nuclear remains politically contested and operationally limited. Renewable energy is expanding, but not at a scale that removes the strategic weight of imported fuels in the near term. So the country is forced to manage energy security through stockpiles, diversification, efficiency measures, long-term contracts, diplomacy, alliance assumptions, and gradual power sector adjustment. All of that help. None of it fully resolves the underlying condition. That is why Japan's energy anxiety runs deeper than headlines about oil prices or Gulf tensions might suggest. The anxiety comes from knowing that the room for maneuver is narrower than it looks. Japan is highly capable, but capability is not the same thing as control. It can plan. It can buffer. It can adapt. But it cannot easily escape the fact that its prosperity depends on systems it does not entirely command. Fukushima made that truth harder, because it weakened one of the few major domestic pillars Japan once had, and once that domestic buffer shrank, every external shock began to matter more. That is what fragility means in a country like Japan. Not weakness in the obvious sense, but dependence under pressure. Not collapse, but narrow margins. Not chaos, but a highly advanced society living with fewer fallback options than its surface stability would suggest. That is why Japan's energy question is not just about economics or technology. It is also about strategy, alliance structure, and the future psychology of the Japanese state. Japan depends not only on imported fuel, but on a wider maritime order to keep that fuel moving. For decades, that order has been underwritten above all by U.S. power, especially American naval dominance and the broader security system that protects sea lane commerce. In practical terms, then Japan's energy security is inseparable from maritime security, alliance credibility, deterrence, and the continued functioning of an international order that allows distant fuel flows to reach Japanese ports. But here the story becomes more uncomfortable. Japan and the United States do not share the same degree of dependence on Middle Eastern energy anymore. Japan's own energy planning documents acknowledge that the Shale revolution has reduced America's direct reliance on Middle Eastern energy and changed the strategic balance surrounding the region. That creates an asymmetry Japan cannot ignore. Japan's energy lifeline remains deeply exposed to Gulf instability and choke point risk, where the ally on whom it ultimately relies has less direct material dependence on that same route than it once did. That does not mean the alliance disappears. It does not mean the United States ceases to matter. Quite the opposite. It means the alliance becomes even more important, but also more structurally uneven in one key respect.
Japan still has enormous skin in the game. America has relatively less than before. And once that asymmetry enters the picture, energy insecurity becomes more than a technical matter. It starts shaping strategic thought. It feeds defense anxiety. It sharpens concern about sea lane security. It raises the importance of maritime protection, alliance management, regional stability, nuclear restarts, renewable expansion, and hard questions about long-term resilience. It can also influence domestic politics, because a society that senses its prosperity depends on fragile external arteries may gradually become more security conscious, more defensive, and more alert to shifts in the international environment. This is the deeper lesson. Japan is not simply vulnerable because it lacks abundant domestic energy. Many countries lack resources. Japan is vulnerable because too much of its prosperity still depends on imported fuel, moving through choke points it cannot fully control. Under a security architecture it does not alone command. In a geopolitical environment that is becoming more contested rather than less, that is a very specific kind of fragility. It is the fragility of a first-rank industrial economy, whose daily normality depends on distant order holding together. So if you want to understand the hidden tension beneath Japan's stability, do not just watch GDP, stock indexes, or headline growth numbers. Watch the tankers crossing Hormuz. Watch the reactors that remain offline. Watch the LNG inventories, the emergency reserves, the shipping routes, the alliance assumptions, and the strategic calculations holding all of them together. Because that is where the real story begins. Japan's prosperity is real. Its sophistication is real. Its resilience is real, but the energy foundation beneath that prosperity remains more fragile than many people realize. And as long as that remains true, Japan's stability will always carry a shadow.
We are not just following events. We are tracing the forces that move them.